as custodian of his father's archives and art collection, co-editing and publishing a series of important volumes of letters, papers and essays, as well as a memoir by his father. He's been equally active in curating art exhibits in such venues as the Irish Consulate in New York, at Boston College, and at the Townland Library here at NYU. An accomplished lecturer in his own right, Cormac endowed the Ernie OMalley lecture series in 1999. So my predecessor, Joe Lee, gave the inaugural lecture that year. I had the honour to give the 14th Ernie OMalley lecture in 2012. So if my chronology is correct, and you've just confirmed it, tonight's lecture is the 20th in the series, which is a significant milestone. We're delighted to welcome as our Ernie OMalley lecturer, Professor Tara McCarthy of Central Michigan State University, a leading authority on Irish-American history and Irish-American women's history in particular. Introducing her will be my colleague Marion Casey, one of the foremost historians of Irish America. Before Marion comes, I'd like to call Cormac to the podium to say a few words. Okay, so welcome.
Thank you, Kevin, and welcome to you all. I recognize many as familiar faces, so I know you should feel at home in Ireland House. As Kevin said, today is the 20th anniversary. You know, it's sort of like watching your son grow up, or daughter, and to get to the stage, not yet 21, but 20 is great, and it was matured on the 18th. And so we are getting there. I just thought, as Kevin said, it was in honor of my father, principally as an expression of what he wanted to do was have a new beginning. And I thought when I was starting in Glucksman, Ireland House, what we needed in part was a contribution in the Irish-American field, and so rather than rehash what would be quite normal, which would be on the Ernie OMalley subject of getting something on Irish history, I really wanted to start lend a voice to the Irish American. And so our lectures have been on Irish American subjects, including literature, the antebellum Irish stereotypes, New York riots, Michael Davitt's American experience, Daniel O'Connell's impact on the American abolitionists, Abraham Lincoln, somebody talked about. Kevin Kenny gave us that one. Mother Jones, how Marion gave us a marvelous example of Bishop John Hughes. Anyway, so we cover a spectrum, and tonight is covering in that same area. I should note that though we have only reached 20, I'm hoping that there'll be more women representatives in our speakers. Today, Tara is number 5 out of 20, so don't know whether we'll ever get to parity or exceed parity, but that's an issue of who's publishing what book and when they come out and how the selection process goes, but we hope we get there. Anyway, Marion Casey will make an introduction of Tara. Just wanted to tell you a little bit on Marion. She got her MA and PhD.
That's not
and she is now Associate Professor of Irish American History as well as Director of the Undergraduate Studies at her home, Glucksman, Ireland House. Here's Marion.
Cormac is a very generous man in his sentiments, but the endowment of this lecture is living proof that from small seeds great things come. I mean, we could not have predicted 20 years ago that we would be here tonight, or that the eminent list of people for each of those 20 years. Really, it represents the wide range and the development of a field of Irish studies, which did not exist really 20 years ago. It has really come from the margins into the center, and I'm proud that it is based really at New York University, and where we also have the Archives of Irish America, which is, I think, 21 years old. So, yes, great. So my job tonight is to ask you to silence phones, if anybody hasn't done that yet, right? Okay. And I'll make a few brief comments. Writing a dozen years ago, the eminent historian Jolie pointed out that, quote, the Irish immigrant woman, as the subject of thoroughly scholarly inquiry, was long neglected because the two types of historians most eager to explore her history, labor historians and exponents of women's history, were more interested in limited aspects of the behavior of Irish women than in their full lives as actually lived. I'm happy to say that New York University's own Professor Hazia Diner, sitting here in the front row, pioneered the scholarly path which brings Professor Tara McCarthy to Glucksman Island House tonight. Jolie also remarked that, quote, despite advances made in the study of the subject, much remains to be learned about all aspects of women's lives. The image of real 19th and early 20th century Irish American women that emerges from such serious research into the values, attitudes, and behavior of actual women, as distinct from, and sometimes in contrast to, views about them expressed mainly by outside observers, is of a people with a sense of their own dignity and their own rights as understood in the context of their own culture. Tara McCarthy's work is firmly grounded in this very ethos. Although their causes, strategies, and motivations may have differed from middle-class Protestant women, she writes, Irish American women were part of a larger trend towards women's influence on public life. And her new book, Respectability and Reform, Irish American Women's Activism, 1880 to 1920, which is just published by Syracuse University Press, looks at their contributions in three spheres of influence outside the home: nationalism, workers' rights, and the suffrage movement, all of which at various times have converged in Irish American history. Tonight, as the 20th OMalley lecturer, she will look specifically at the work of the Ladies' Ancient Order of Hibernians in the early 20th century. Now, this is more than appropriate. We've talked about the 20th anniversary and the 5th Women OMalley lecture, but this is a year that also marks the 35th anniversary of Hazia Diner's book, Erin's Daughters in America. And if there's anything you can say about the Ladies' Ancient Order of Hibernians, they're most certainly Erin's Daughters in America. Tara McCarthy received her doctorate in history from the University of Rochester, and then she spent a year as a postdoctoral teaching fellow in the writing program at the University of Rochester, and went on from there to be visiting professor of history at Canisius College in Buffalo, and then joined the faculty of Central Michigan University. Dr. McCarthy's main research interests are American women, social reform movements, and immigration. She contributed a chapter on the Ladies' Land League to the volume Susan B. Anthony and the Struggle for Equal Rights, which was published in 2012. And she received a research grant from the Irish American Cultural Institute for Respectability and Reform. Her current projects trace the political activities of Irish American women in the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, focusing on Irish nationalism, ethnic organizations, suffrage, and the labor movement. Please join me in welcoming Tara McCarthy to the podium of Glucksman Island.
Thank you, and thank you for being here. It's been an amazing chance to come to New York. It's warmer here than back home, so I was able to even bring some shorts. It was in the 50s in Michigan, although I think I got back up to a little bit warmer weather. I want to start by thanking everyone at Glucksman House for inviting me. Thank you to Ernie OMalley for this lecture and this opportunity, and thank you to Miriam for providing a babysitter for my children. So I thought I would start by talking a little bit about sources. I was talking with Miriam a little bit about sources a few minutes ago too, and one of the things that we agreed on, and I'm sure Professor Dine will agree on, is it's frustrating to not be able to find very much about women, and so you want to write about women and you can't find very much. So I thought I would start by talking about how I ended up with a whole chapter, which didn't make it into the book, but a whole chapter on the Ladies' Auxiliary of the Ancient Order of Hibernians. And I will continue to call the Ladies Auxiliary, even though I know that's not right because I can't help myself, and I kind of am a 19th century historian, so I'm stuck in the past, and that's what they used to call themselves. But essentially what happened is, as I had decided to do this project on Irish American women, I started looking for sources, and I started reading a lot of newspapers, particularly Ethnic Press, the Irish World, later the Gaelic American, and then of course the National Hibernian, which is the newspaper of the AOH, started publication in 1901. So that gave me a chance to find people. Unfortunately, with all my looking, I never really find very much on 19th century women. But what I am going to tell you is about the founding of the auxiliary, but I'm going to focus mostly on the 20th century because that's where I was able to find sources. So I feel like my next question that I want to ask is, why am I focusing on just a few women? And the obvious answer is what I could find. But also because these are the leaders, the very first president, the very second president of the Ladies Auxiliary, and then also there were two women who became national speakers for the AOH, so not just the ladies, but for the whole AOH, who were national speakers. And so it's really this handful, really half a dozen women who occupy most of the sources on the Ladies Auxiliary and the AOH for a 20 to 30 year time span. And so I'm able to give you a bit of a portrait of them, but even then, I'm not able to tell you very much about them. I can tell you maybe if they were married or not, where they lived, maybe what their husbands did or not, but not a whole lot of information. But I'm trying to give you a little bit of that as well, okay? So let me start with the founding of the auxiliary, and then I'm going to go into talking a little bit about who these women were, and then also what their major campaigns were. The overarching point really that I want to make today is that not only did these women make significant contributions to shaping Irish American culture and Irish American identity, but also that they found a way to make it also about women. And so they took a movement which largely focused on men, and they said, hey, let's talk about women too. And so I'm going to highlight two women in particular who did that, one through the writing of a book and another through the building of a monument, so hence the title. So let's start with the founding of the auxiliary then. There were local chapters, which of course I'm not able to find much of any information on in the 19th century, particularly starting in the 1880s and going into the 1890s. But it wasn't until 1894 that the women first petitioned the national AOH to be recognized. And so in 1894, they asked the men to recognize their auxiliary, and that would still be was still being debated 2 years later in 1896. But essentially, what interested me about this moment is that they declared their interest in working shoulder to shoulder with the men, but they also talked about the American Protective Association, about the fact that Catholic women needed protection, particularly teachers in public schools. And so they even, in asking for an auxiliary, said, hey, we need to get organized, we need protection, we need to work with the men, but we also need the men to, get involved in school boards and things like that to try and protect women who were moving heavily into teaching at the time. 2 years later, in 1896, they were still talking about this, and there were women at the 1896 National AOH Convention as non-voting delegates. And so the discussion continued, and they were having what one newspaper called a lively discussion about whether or not women should be included. They were having a lively fight about whether women should not be included. And so I wanted to give you a couple of quotes of what some of the women said. Mary McWhorter, who I'll give the background of in just a minute, was recalling this early struggle, and she said of it, quote, "It is a strange feature in the usually social makeup of the average Irish American that while having implicit confidence in the good judgment of the womenfolk of his household, he never, to use a common phrase, warms to the idea of their taking an active part in anything outside of their household or limited social circle." McWhorter, who was from Ireland, grew up in Ireland and went to the national schools, attributed this attitude to, quote, the old land in the days before the land league. So again, she's pointing to the ladies' land league as an important watershed moment. And she believed that, quote, fresh blood and progressive ideas in the AOH during the 1880s inspired the land league, inspired by the land league, ultimately secured a place for women in the upbuilding of the AOH. Another quote from a future president of the LAAOH recalled the ladies' first initiative for organization and said, quote, "To some of the delegates, no doubt, this request seems ill-advised, and they felt like saying, women have no business in society affairs of this kind. Your place is in the home. Yet she also continued, quote, "Every woman deserving the name loves her home, but how many lives are worn out with toil and care for home as though there were nothing else to live for and think of?" And she ultimately called women's total devotion to the home selfish. So these women are from a very early, from the 1890s on, fighting not only to be included in the auxiliary, but to argue that women should have a larger public role as well, okay? So what I want to do is focus on a few of the national leaders, give you a little bit of background, and again, it's sparse, but I admit that that is what I have for you. And then I'll focus on the actual campaigns that they were involved in, which are particularly 20th century campaigns. The first president of the Ladies' Auxiliary of the Ancient Order of Hibernians was a woman by the name of Anna Malia. Now I want to also clarify that although they got recognition for the National Auxiliary, when they were first recognized, the women didn't have the right to elect their own officers or manage their own funds. And so it took until 1906 for there to be national presidents, which is why they were all then 20th century. But after 1906, they had home rule to a complete degree, and that's the phrase they used, home rule. And they could then manage their own affairs, elect their own officers. And so the first officer, and I apologize if I forgot you were over there for a minute. The first woman who was elected was a woman by the name of Anna Malia. She was born in England of Irish parents. She came to the U.S. as a child, and she was a school teacher. And not surprisingly, you're going to see a lot of school teachers in this discussion, okay? She taught in the Scranton, Pennsylvania public schools for many years. And as far as I can tell, remained single until her 50s, but did marry eventually a contractor named Michael Ruddy. And that's really what I know about her. She's not going to feature too heavily. I kind of focus more on the next two. The next president is a woman by the name of Ellen Ryan Jolly, who was born in Boston, but from Pawtucket, Rhode Island. She was also a teacher. She also served on the school board in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, so really, again, in New England, one of the early Catholic women to serve on a school board, although a lot less known than, I forget the woman from Boston who did it. And she also seems to have run a millinery business. My guess would be that that was her mother's, but I can't prove that, but I think it was. But she did run a millinery business as well. Her husband, John Jolly, worked for a gas company and was active in local Democratic politics. Jolly herself received some political appointments from Democratic governors of Rhode Island, and also became the first woman to receive an honorary doctorate of law from Notre Dame in 1918, and I'll explain that in just a minute. And ultimately, in 1930, she won, she received a papal medal for her service to the church. She had a close relationship with Notre Dame, which I don't know if it began, but it definitely continued long after. Her son, who attended there, died very young, and so she continued to write letters. And there are letters, that's the only person I have letters from, there are letters from her to various presidents of Notre Dame that she kept writing until at least the 1930s. When I was in grad school and I was doing research on her and I was going through newspapers trying to find anything I could about her, I had a roommate who was working on her master's degree, and she used to come home and say, "What did you find about Mrs. Jolly today?" And so it was like, always kind of scrounging to find things about Mrs. Jolly. The third national president is a woman by the name of Mary McWhorter. I already gave you a quote from her just a minute ago. And she was Irish born, unlike the other two. She grew up in Ireland. She attended the national schools. Evidence suggests that her father died young but was a nationalist himself. And evidence also suggests that she came to Chicago as a teenager. She married a printer by the name of William McWhorter. Her maiden name was Mulcahy. And she also went on to found the first Chicago division of the LAAOH. So again, you can see that these women were very involved from really the early parts of the order. There were two women who were also national lecturers for the AOH, so I felt like they deserved a shout out as well, and they'll get mentioned and quoted a little bit as well. One was a woman by the name of Charlotte Holloway. She's fascinating, but again, very hard to find stuff on. As far as I can tell, she never married. She supported herself with her writing. She wrote children's stories and other articles for newspapers. And then she also kind of ran her own company where she gave speeches and lectures, and she talked about Ireland and things like that. That's really what I can tell you about her right now, except that she was a suffragist, and she's the one of this group that was active in the suffrage movement at this point anyway. The other is a woman by the name of Catherine OKeefe O'Mahony, who's a little bit more known, I think, than Charlotte Holloway is. She came with her parents to Lawrence, Massachusetts when she was just a small child, so she essentially grew up in Massachusetts. She became the first Catholic teacher at Lawrence High School in 1875, where she taught history, not surprisingly, because we're going to talk about her in a minute, and speech. She gave her first public speech for the Ladies' Land League after a visit from Fanny Parnell in the 1880s. And then she went on to do also quite a lot of writing in Catholic periodicals. So she was a public speaker, she was a writer, she was a teacher, and again, so not surprisingly, she'll go on to become a national lecturer for the AOH. Now what I want to focus on is the campaigns that these women got involved in, and I want to point out a couple things. First of all, it's not unique to women and it's not unique to the Ancient Order of Hibernians, but not surprisingly, during the Gaelic revival, a number of Irish societies are going to be working on these campaigns. And so there are 3 campaigns that I mentioned. 2 of them I'm going to focus on tonight. One of them is influencing school textbook choices. So in other words, more advocating against textbooks than choosing textbooks. But in other words, if there's something offensive in one textbook, to try and get the textbook banned, which Jolly was pretty good at doing, especially since she served on the school board. She was pretty well connected in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. Another one is teaching Irish history. So teaching Irish history in the public schools, teaching Irish history in the parochial schools. And then the last one is also celebrating the influence of the Irish on American history. So you're going to see those 3 themes in the stories that I'm going to tell. Now, each of those 3 themes is a larger theme in the Gaelic Revival, and also the way the American Irish interacted with the Gaelic Revival. In other words, that the Gaelic Revival in the U.S. was in part about celebrating the Irish language, but also in part about celebrating Irish history in the U.S. and Irish contributions to U.S. history. The other thing I want to mention is that women played an important role in the Gaelic Revival, and that's probably not that surprising to you. But essentially, the women of the LAAOH were able to bring this larger sort of networking organization to women's role in the Gaelic Revival. I want to give you one more quote here. This one's from the Brooklyn Gaelic Society. 1905, I think, is the date of the quote. But essentially, the speaker, who is a male, is trying to kind of recruit and celebrate women in the Gaelic Revival in the U.S. And so he said, quote, "I believe one of the reasons why the Gaelic movement has taken such a strong hold upon our people is that the women have been allowed to participate in it on terms of equality with men." He outlined several roles for women as mothers. Women could, quote, "inculcate race pride, which is the very foundation upon which love of country and everything that pertains to it nationally rests." And then women also, he said, women also need to be vigilant about their children's education, seeing to it that the mental food supplied their children is not the kind likely to produce in them false ideas regarding race. So then you get in your kind of textbook censorship idea. So the first big campaign then was the celebration of Irish history, or the Irish history campaign. And so the women of the AOH got involved in celebrating Irish history, beginning really with the 1890s. The American Irish Historical Society had already started to really highlight the role of the Irish in American history, but a lot of that tended to be Irish contributions to the American Revolution, contributions as military heroes. And so women were doing that, but then they were also saying, okay, well, let's also include women, let's talk about women's contributions as well. This Irish history campaign was led by a man named Michael Growan. Michael Growan was a professor at Marquette University, but he was also appointed by the AOH to lead the Irish history campaign. And so he worked on it very closely with the women of the LAAOH, particularly Ellen Ryan Jolly, Mary McWhorter, and Anna Malia, so the 3 women I outlined to you as the first 3 presidents of the LAAOH. And so they started publishing quite a lot in the National Hibernian, in the Irish World, and other Irish American newspapers, encouraging people to teach their children about Irish history, to advocate for teaching Irish history, to talk to the priests in their local parish to make sure Irish history was being taught in parochial schools. And what they called it particularly womanly work. In other words, women were mothers, women were teachers, women had good relationships with their parishes, and they could really advocate for Irish history. And they also saw this as a very important way to teach children about pride in their race, and also to guard against any ideas that were offensive as well. Ellen Ryan Jolly said, Mary McWhorter said that women were the best suited to approach the parish priest with their, quote, good, gracious Irish manners. And Ellen Ryan Jolly agreed that women should take up the cause because they wielded influence in educational matters. As an article in the Gaelic American reminded readers, Irish American women could make the movement a success, not only as mothers, but also because so many Irish Americans were moving into teaching at that point. Now, by about 1915, they were getting pretty frustrated with the Irish movement, largely because they didn't feel like it was a success. About 400 schools were teaching Irish history by that point. Some parochial schools were requiring the teaching of Irish history. And Ellen Ryan Jolly was talking about trying to get Irish history taught in the public schools and not just the parochial schools. So in 1907, she introduced a petition backed by local Irish groups and also the AOH to offer, quote, a more definitive and correct history of Ireland and the Irish people in public schools. And when asked if the study of Irish history should be compulsory, Jolly argued that children were required to study English history. And in a city with a large Irish population, non-Irish children would benefit from understanding the heritage of their neighbors. In other words, yes, she believed that it should be compulsory. And if they had to study British history, why shouldn't they have to study Irish history? Jolly also got involved in fighting against textbooks. So there were a couple in particular that she found offensive and tried to get eliminated. And as I mentioned, she had served several years on the school board by then as well. One was by the American Book Company. I would love at some point to dive into their records and see what else I can find. And that's at Syracuse University, but I have not been there in a very long time. But one she thought was offensive to the Civil War General Thomas Mahar because the Irish Brigade was not mentioned. And then Jolly also writes in her letters about a, quote, 2-year struggle in which she compelled local authorities to restore to Barnes' History of the United States a mutilated footnote in which they maliciously deprived Mahar's brigade at Fredericksburg of the glory which even the London Times had been obliged to admit. So again, that's quoting Jolly. In another struggle, also Ellen Ryan Jolly, the public high school discontinued the use of an English history textbook which Jolly described as, quote, diabolical in its attack upon church and priesthood. And after Jolly and 2 other members of the United Irish Societies drafted a questionnaire to all candidates, asking them to go on record condemning the text. They asked all the school board candidates who were running for office to take the pledge to get rid of this textbook when they were running. By 1915, they were considering the movement, the president, I think, of the AOH declared it a failure. So the women were getting pretty frustrated. But essentially what they were saying was that not enough people were supporting it. It wasn't being taught in enough schools. However, I want to move on from textbooks and Irish history in schools to talking about monuments. And then also I'm going to talk a little bit more about history and one particular book. In addition to celebrating the contributions of Irish military heroes in articles and books and things like that, there were a couple monument movements that I want to focus on. One of them is the Barrie Monument, which I'll get to in just a minute, and then the other is the Nuns of the Battlefield, which is what I'm gonna finish up with. So let me skip this PowerPoint here, and we'll come back to it if I need it. Oh, I guess I don't need it quite yet. Apparently I got my slides out of order. We'll talk about the Barrie Monument first. So one of the movements was, as I mentioned before, to celebrate the contributions of Irish Americans to American military history. And so the American Revolution obviously is featured quite prominently. John Barrie is one of 2 men considered the father of the American Navy. Sometimes people talk about John Paul Jones as being the father of the American Navy, and some people talk about John Barrie as being the father of the American Navy. What happened was a number of Irish societies began advocating for a monument to John Barrie. There are other monuments to John Barrie. This was not the first monument to John Barrie, but it is the monument in Washington, D.C. to John Barrie, and it was constructed with government money, so they allocated $50,000 to build this monument. The AOH wasn't the leader of this movement. They certainly supported this movement, and it matters to our story in a couple of ways. One is that when the monument was finally unveiled, Woodrow Wilson kind of offended the Irish American community. This is a story, so I'm seeing some shaking heads, and you kind of know the story. But the other reason it matters to our story is it inspired Ellen Ryan Jolly to try and build a monument of her own, okay? And in that case, she wanted the monument to be to women. So I'm gonna tell you a little bit about it, and I'll give you the Wilson quote in case you haven't come across it. The monument was unveiled in 1914. It had to get congressional approval to build a monument in Washington, D.C. Congress also allocated the money for it, and a number of different Irish societies were involved in this. And then in 1914, when it was dedicated, and Jolly was there when it was dedicated, this is what Wilson told his audience. He said, quote, "John Barrie was an Irishman, but his heart crossed the Atlantic with him. He did not leave it in Ireland." And then I'm skipping here a little bit. "Some Americans need hyphens in their names because only part of them has come over. But when the whole man has come over, heart and thought and all, the hyphen drops of its own weight out of his name." Okay? So, not surprisingly, people weren't happy about this. The National Hibernian, which is the voice of the AOH, said, quote, "Surely Irish Americans can remain hyphenated and be as loyal as the 12 signers of the Declaration of Independence of Irish blood." And another Hibernian author maintained that, quote, "We have become American from the moment our feet touch the soil, which has been reddened with the blood of multitudes of Irish pioneers and soldiers." And again, in both of those quotes, you hear references to the American Revolution, references to militarism, references to lost blood, okay? So what then happens is the women of the LAAOH start coming along and saying, okay, we're going to tell stories about women and women's history, which is, I think, the part of the story I find the most interesting, okay? So the American Revolution we'll highlight again, but women's contributions to it, and then we're going to talk about the Civil War in a minute, too. So the women of the LAAOH support the movements of the men, but also talk about women, in particular women's contributions to the American Revolution, and then women's contributions to the Civil War. So those two themes will be highlighted. Ellen Ryan Jolly gave an address in 1910, so before the monument, she gave an address in Rhode Island. She was very active in history, the Rhode Island Historical Association, she was president of. In 1910, she gave a speech called Women of the Revolution. During a Rhode Island Independence Day celebration in 1910, she argued that, quote, "A knowledge of the heroism of the revolutionary women seems to have passed with the generation which witnessed it. We've forgotten about women's contributions to the American Revolution." Not only did Jolly talk of patriotism and sacrifice made by mothers, daughters, and wives, but she also wrote about the Daughters of Liberty and the importance of women's efforts to supporting boycotts during the Revolution. Although this speech was not specifically about the Irish, she does still include the Irish and talk about Irish contributions to the American Revolution in that speech as well. In her home state of Rhode Island, Jolly also worked to integrate Irish history, as we've talked, and she explained that, quote, "We want to teach our little girls to know the great women of pagan Ireland, to give the Colleens the privilege of learning about the women of Limerick who fought beside their kinsmen, and to let them know the bravery of Captain Molly Pitcher, the woman from gallant Tipperary who distinguished herself in the American Revolution. To accomplish this, the United Irish Societies of Pawtucket, Rhode Island, that's where my parents are from, of which she was also president, offered medals to parochial schools to sponsor essay contests on Irish history, and she made sure to include a topic called Illustrious Irish Women. Now, the other woman that I want to talk about is this one, Catherine O'Keefe O'Mahony. So I've given you a quick introduction to her. She wrote a book in 1907 called Famous Irish Women. This, actually, she talks about in the book, she admits that she didn't do her own research, but she's essentially compiling all of these stories and bringing up all of these stories about Irish women, and these are women in Ireland and also Irish American women, so she takes care to include Irish American women as well. The book comes out from her own, you know, like Lawrence, it's Lawrence, Massachusetts, it wasn't like a major distributor, but it comes out from a Lawrence press in 1907. And in the introduction to it, she says that although the Gaelic revival has been very important, she expresses concern that men are featured more than women in the Gaelic revival, and says, although, quote, "The history of one is never complete without that of the other, whether the women appear as mothers, sisters, wives, or daughters." She also says she's going to turn her attention to, quote, "Women famous before the world for bravery, virtue, sanctity, and intellectual gifts." as well as for martial bravery and beauty. And she also says she hopes to inspire her readers with, quote, an appreciation of the people of our race and of their many endowments of virtue, valor, patriotism, and genius that will inspire for themselves nobler purposes and higher ideals. She wants to inspire pride in the Irish in America. She wants to celebrate Irish history and Irish American history. And she does this by including a section on women in the American Revolution. And this is interesting because she includes not just Molly Pitcher, that's the story, Ellen Ryan Jolly's told that story a lot too, but other women as well. I think there are about 5 women that she includes in her American Revolution section. One is Molly Pitcher, but she also includes the mother of Andrew Jackson in the book. And then a woman, this I did not know this story before, a woman named Esther Gaston, who was, the story was told that she and I think her sister or maybe 2 sisters accounted 3 men who were about to desert during the American Revolution. And so she essentially offered to take their guns and go fight in their place, and that kind of shamed the men into going back to their posts. And so she included that story and other stories as well. And she wrote, quote, volumes might interestingly be written about the many women of Irish birth or blood who manifested bravery, patriotism, and noble self-sacrificing during the same war, the American Revolution. Now, the other example I wanted to give you is from the Civil War, but still Catherine O'Keefe O'Mahony, and I'll get back to Ellen Ryan Jolly in just a minute. This picture is from a woman that became known as Michigan Bridget. Michigan Bridget is apparently, and I haven't done research on her either, but she seems to come up in sources with about 3 different last names, so what's known about her is a little bit sketchy. And it's not even for sure known that her husband really did fight with the Michigan Cavalry, but the way the story goes, her husband fought with the Michigan Cavalry, the 1st Michigan Cavalry, during the Civil War, and she essentially became involved in the fighting, became involved in nursing fallen soldiers. There's a story in the book about how she went back to retrieve the bodies of fallen leaders after the fighting was over. When she did this, she found that there were still some men on the fields who were gravely wounded, but not dead, and so she managed to get back and arrange for a cart to come back and get the wounded off the field. So there are all these stories about her, but nobody seems to know quite who she really was or where she really ended up. But the story goes that after the Civil War, she went out west and continued to sort of be involved in military operations. So there's your Civil War story. Interestingly, though, she didn't stop with just the military theme, and she also included women religious. And so there's a chapter in the book about foundresses of American branches of religious orders who are Irish. There's also a chapter in the book about the founding of Trinity College. So again, she really does a lot of women's history in this particular piece. And then the final set of chapters are about literary women. And again, she talks about Irish literary women. She talks about Irish literary women who died outside of Ireland, is the way she phrases it, which is a little bit strange. And then she talks about Irish women, like Catherine Conway, who was the first female editor of the Boston Pilot. So she really does quite a lot of women's history, but also celebrates her own contemporary Irish American women as well. Now, the final story that I want to tell you tonight is about the nuns of the battlefield. This was this sort of Jolly's ultimate project, and she got the idea for it in 1914. Not surprisingly, as I mentioned, she was at the dedication of the John Barrie Memorial, and she decided that she wanted to work towards a monument to women religious who served as nurses during the Civil War. And her argument was that they, nursed fallen soldiers both north and south, and also, of course, that they were mainly of Irish birth or extraction is the word that she used. But essentially, I think she gives a number of like 90% were of Irish birth or Irish descent. And so she argues that this would be a splendid deed of grateful patriotism to build a monument to these women, and that 90% were Irish or Irish American. And so she starts a movement. She talks about the importance of other Protestant women and how they've been remembered by history and they've been celebrated by history, but that Catholic women haven't. And so she starts this movement. It's a complicated movement because unlike the Barrie Monument, it's not going to be paid for by public funds, so she's not going to get $50,000 from the government to do it. And so she not only has to get approval from Congress to build a monument, but she also has to get the money to build a monument, okay? So in order to build the monument, she needs congressional approval, she needs an act of Congress. And originally, of course, they want to build this monument in Arlington National Cemetery. That she's not going to get permission to do. But she is going to sort of do battle and try and get elected representatives to really help and lobby for her, particularly her home, from her home state of Rhode Island, represented by the name of Ambrose Kennedy, really takes the lead on sponsoring the bill in the House of Representatives. But she also recruits men from other states, largely through the Ladies Auxiliary. So she says to Mary McWhorter is from Chicago, she says, okay, so you recruit your Illinois people, and then she goes to other women, you recruit them. So essentially she kind of works through both the AOH and the LAAOH to try and get Congress people on board for this project. Even with the help of a number of congressional representatives, she has a very difficult time getting the bill passed. And then on top of that, as I mentioned before, she does exchange letters with a number of presidents of Notre Dame, and so it turns out that Notre Dame was very well kind of acquainted with this battle, kind of trying to, I don't know if they were helping behind the scenes, but I'm sure they were. She's writing letters to President of Notre Dame named John Kavanaugh. And so she's exchanging letters with Kavanaugh on the project, but she wants to keep the alliance secret because she doesn't want, what she, in her words, she doesn't want any priest to be humiliated in this sort of, political fight. Ultimately, the bill runs into political trouble when a congressman from Indiana introduces a bill to create a rival monument, so that she wants to build a monument to Catholic women, and so there's a separate monument for, I think, Presbyterian women apparently, and so they both are asking for permission, and so neither of them get it at first. As far as I know, there was never a monument built to Presbyterian nurses, at least not at that point, so I don't know what happened to that monument. However, Jolly doesn't give up, and she's going to keep going, and with the next Congress, she's going to start again, and so it takes several years. And in these several years, they agree to compromise on location, so Arlington National Cemetery is out. However, they agree to a different site, which I'll talk about in just a minute, and ultimately, in 1918, the bill is called out of the Library Committee, and it passes both the House and the Senate. And Congress is given assurances that the Ladies Auxiliary is going to pay for it. Okay. Wilson signs the bill for the monument on Good Friday, 1918, which inspires Kavanaugh to write, quote, "The day and the hour of the President's action makes me hope that it represents the crucifixion of bigotry. Yet he and Jolly believe the long fight for the bill resulted from anti-Catholic discrimination, and Jolly told Kavanaugh on several occasions that she wished someday to tell him the quote-unquote real story of the battle, but Kavanaugh knew enough to say, quote, "If the story is ever written of the vicissitudes through which this monument was obliged to pass before reaching its present station, the world will learn with astonishment of how much bigotry still exists, even in regard to the gentle and heroic nun in this country." Now, the Irish World was very positive in its coverage and called the final location at the intersection of Rhode Island Avenue and M Street a most prominent and central one. But Kavanaugh had his concerns, again, private concerns about the location because he wanted it to reach a non-Catholic audience, and he felt like it had kind of been put too close to St. Matthew's Church. Kavanaugh said, quote, in the letter said, quote, "Our fathers agree that for the purposes we all have in mind, the farther this monument is removed from Catholic surroundings, the better. Placed near St. Matthew's Church, it will look as if one of the ordinary statues had carelessly strayed out the front door and gotten lost on the street. But placed downtown in the hurly-burly of Washington, it will, as Shakespeare says, shine as a good deed in a naughty world." So they kept these views quiet and to themselves, and ultimately the plan for the monument had to be adjusted because it was too big. The original project was supposed to be for a larger location, and so the sculptor had to make it smaller, and then there was still some back and forth about design. But ultimately, the monument was completed, and it was built, and it was dedicated in 1924. So the picture I have up here is actually the dedication of the monument. So this is Jolly here. And you can see the dedication there. Now I want to show you some pictures of the monument itself. So I got a couple. I don't know how well you can see. You can't see it. Oh, you have your own screen in there. Okay. So that's the sort of the main facade of the statue. And then I've got a couple pictures of the sides as well. And so this, I've been looking up, I've been interested in monuments lately, and I've been kind of looking up, and there's a book that's all Washington D.C. monuments. It's about this big. And so I was looking it up. This is the first monument built to nurses in Washington, D.C. The Red Cross Nurses Monument wasn't completed until the 1950s. And then, of course, the Vietnam Nurses Monument was the 1990s. So there's been a lot of talk lately about, that there aren't very many monuments to women, and that many of those monuments aren't to actual historical women. There's been a lot of discussion. I know in New York there are some plans for a Stanton Anthony statue, and I think maybe one other. But so what is amazing, really, I think, about this story is it's not very well known. Is that in 1924 this statue was unveiled in Washington D.C. thanks to private efforts from the Ladies Auxiliary and the AOH together, and then of course the money had to be raised for it as well. Let me sum up a few final thoughts about this, and then of course answer questions as well. I think one of the things that really draws my attention about this Nuns of the Battlefield is how much work Jolly did, not just to get the bill through Congress, but she actually then published a book. So there's a book, if you're interested, I think you can probably get it on Google for, it's old enough now that I'm sure you can get it, find it on Google as well. But there's a book called the same thing, Nuns of the Battlefield. So that, and she published a lot of articles in the press, so Irish American press largely, about the nuns of the battlefield. So that she did that research, right? She went out and she did a whole bunch of research on these women, wrote the articles, wrote the book. And then one thing I thought was also fascinating is that after the statue, after the monument was finished, she wanted a movie. She wanted to make a movie of it. Now that didn't happen. So final thoughts. I think one of the things that interests me about the Ladies Auxiliary of the Ancient Order of Hibernians is that, number one, these women really had to push to get the National Auxiliary recognized, and then ultimately to get a chance to elect their own officers, handle their own funds, and essentially really contribute to these campaigns. While many of the campaigns were the campaigns of the AOH, and they were providing, really important sort of, footwork to it, they also found a way to make it unique to their own purposes in order to say, hey, women have important voices, women need to be heard, and we want to celebrate the contributions of women. And for this particular campaign, that meant also celebrating the contributions of historical women, which means these women also became historians themselves, gave speeches, wrote newspaper articles, wrote books about women, and ultimately built a monument to women as well. Thank you. Yes. Questions? I should give you the first shot because you've been neglected.
Any questions? Is back there? Oh, yes, sir.
Since no one I just wanted to comment on Commodore Barrie. I was in Philadelphia taking a bus tour maybe 20 years ago, in the early 90s, and the tour guide made a point of saying that the statue, the head bust of Barrie in Philly, and that was really the Irish community had done this, but her money was with Jones. She, despite the fact that he died in Russia, working for the Russians. But I also wanted to tell you that there are organizations today that are still trying to have wider knowledge in the schools about the Irish contribution here in the United States. The American Irish Teachers Association, I'm associated with, and the Irish American Heritage Committee of the New York City Department of Education are very active in doing this. So I know the LALH as well as the AOH are also continuing to try to emphasize the history of the Irish, but it's an uphill struggle. There continues to be that resistance. So one of the projects that we were successful with was getting the sound curriculum passed through the New York State Legislature and funded through the New York State Assembly, and it is in the schools, but it's a very rich curriculum, and it's a very big curriculum, and sometimes that can be a problem too. But if there are questions on Regents tests, that sort of encourages people to use it. So that's why.
Yeah, and I think there's another movement to build another Barrie memorial. Yeah, there is, right? So I mean, the first Barrie monument was definitely in Philadelphia because that's where he was from. But there's another one being built now, I think, as well.
I think the lady and then Cora. Sorry, just because the people in there.
Thank you so much, Professor McCarthy. That was wonderful. I really appreciated it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I first want to say thank you specifically before I ask a question. I'm a writer concentrating on some magical realism, and the protagonist is a woman who comes to the United States at the turn of the 20th century. So thank you for that. Yeah, I got some great, I'm really looking forward to doing some reading about some of the characters that you mentioned. And then this story of mine is inspired by my grandma, who came at the turn of the century from Ireland to work as a domestic servant. And I just wanted to ask you about that particular line of work, since you didn't mention it. I understand that their paychecks pretty much build St. Patrick's Cathedral, and just wondering about their anything that you can fill us in on as far as your research goes there.
Sure, I'll try, but I feel like I should pass it over to Professor Diner. I actually really didn't do, when I started this project a long time ago, I really wanted to look at like political movements and political activism. And so that's why when I started this talk, I tried to talk about the limitations and of only looking at the leaders. Like I understand that's a limitation, but it's what you can find. And so even as far as the makeup of individual ladies auxiliaries, it's really hard to know. There's just nothing available from the 19th century and not much from the early 20th to know who the rank and file members were. But the leaders were largely teachers. Ernie OMalley, I think, ended up being a principal at some point too. So, and largely second generation as well, at least the ones that I found. So McWhorter is the only one of that early cohort who was Irish born. And so the leadership probably doesn't reflect the membership. In other words, you might have a different leadership, more likely to be American born, more likely to be in the teaching profession than your rank and file members, but it's very hard to do the research. As far as my larger project, I looked at the labor movement, and so this is only one small piece. I tried to just find Irish women everywhere, you know what I mean, and then figure out what they were doing and what organizations they were joining, and so I did, in the book, I do talk about labor leaders, but not specifically domestic servants, so they're mostly factory workers.
Could you just put the LAH in perspective to the AOH in terms of numbers? And I think the highlight was really between 1900 and 1920, and they started to go downhill after that in terms of numbers. But so at their height, what did the women represent?
The women had, I know I had it right in my notes too, they had about 50,000 members in the early 20th century. By World War I, McWhorter was president by then. She's claiming 75,000. I'm not too sure about that, but so, and again, it's never been studied because there are no records, right? So the women are claiming 50,000 shortly after they get the right to elect their own officers around 1906. So they're claiming 50,000. So they grow pretty quickly in those early years. And then they're claiming 75,000 by World War I. The men had like 94,000 by the end of the 19th century. And I'm not sure in the 20th century, but if I had to guess, and someone can correct me if you know better, I'd put them up to 115,000 by World War I. Yeah, maybe 150,000. So much larger, but there is no other large organization. What I mean by that is if you're specifically looking for Catholic women, you don't really find large Catholic women's organizations in the 19th century. So they kind of represent at their 50 or 75,000 by World War I, they represent the largest Irish Catholic organization of women, right? So that's kind of where you find that. For me, that was where I found women. I was trying to find them. That was the logical place to look.
Thank you so much for the lecture. I was wondering, as you were speaking, if other ethnic groups are doing similar things at the time, and if so, whether the Irish in some way are providing a model or a template or doing it first. I was also wondering what, if you're finding similar efforts with Scots-Irish women in any way, because historical commemoration obviously is a huge theme with Scots-Irish, but how it plays out in terms of women's history, I have no idea.
Right. That's a great question. I'm not sure I can answer it. Were other ethnic groups doing it? Yes, I think absolutely. Yeah.
Were a lot of musicians, yeah.
Right. And textbooks, actually, which is interesting. I thought at some point I was going to do a side project on textbooks, which didn't really ever get done. But I know that different groups, whether ethnic groups or not, were really starting to try and influence textbooks by that time period, late 19th, early 20th century. So I think if you looked at textbooks specifically, you would find other groups doing that. Monuments, I don't know, but I was doing a little bit of research kind of out of curiosity, and there was a group of Jewish war veterans that essentially what happened is they were Jewish war veterans who were already members of the GAR, split off and formed their own organization after comments were made in the 1890s about, how basically the Jewish veterans hadn't served their country, or that, and so they created their own separate group of Jewish war veterans. And it started out as Civil War veterans, but it got bigger and bigger as there were more wars. And they built their first monument in New York City. Anyone know it or know where it is? Around 1905, so a little bit earlier. But so you see, I think definitely a parallel there in terms of celebrating sacrifice and contributions to American military history. And I suspect there would be more monuments as well. I just haven't done the research. As far as Scots-Irish, I haven't done it, and I haven't found organizations. And when I started doing my research, I was just reading widely in the press and trying to identify names. And then once I had names, I kind of, I kind of focused in on them. So I don't know what organizations were active that early.
Okay, I'll go to you first because you're closer, and then down to the back.
Hi. I just wondered, during your research, did you come across in like the 19-teens on the work that the ladies did with the Irish immigrant girls coming over, and also with World War I?
Yes, I mean, even earlier in the 19th century, there was work being done, and that didn't really make it into the focus of my study. So, do you mean specifically to the Ladies Auxiliary, or just in general? Specifically to the Ladies Auxiliary? No, I mean, when I read the periodicals of what I had, and I identified the major campaigns, and so these are the major campaigns they were involved in. The other one that I didn't write about, but that they were very much involved in, is trying to raise money for scholarships to Trinity. So from pretty early on, they were trying to send women to college. But as far as specific discussions of helping immigrant women and immigrant girls, I didn't see discussions on the national level in the National Hibernian. That doesn't mean they weren't active in that, but I didn't have the minutes to work from, and that's a pretty big, that's a big handicap. I found very few minutes for the women, and I didn't have time to read all the men's minutes. It would take me like 2 years.
I know you said that there was no records, but what institutions did you go to, which archives did you go to, what you were able to find? time?
Yeah, well, I'm into the American Irish Historical Society. This was I started this project a long time ago, and at that point, it may very well have changed, they had a collection that was uncatalogued, but that also focused on a later time period for me. At the time, I really wanted to find the 19th century stuff, and that just wasn't available. I spent time at New York Public Library, and I did like Frank Walsh's papers, and the Irish collection was the Maloney Irish collection, and I think there was one other that I did when I was there. And I did research in Boston and Philadelphia ultimately, but a lot of that was newspaper research as well.
Did you run across any of the interaction between women here and women that came over from Ireland and then went back, like Kathleen Daly? You know who Kathleen Daly Clark was?
Yes.
Okay, because she lived here from 1901
Uh-huh.
to 1907, and then when she went back, she was one of the few women, she was the only woman involved in the planning for the Easter Uprising. Except her husband, they had 3 kids, her husband forbade her from taking part in the Easter Uprising, because they pretty much knew they were going to be killed if they weren't successful.
Right. Yeah.
So, but there was a lot of interaction with the, I'm sure, with the AOH here.
Yes, and even more so, I think, in the nationalist movement. And I do write about the nationalist movement. I mean, it sort of didn't enter into this talk at all, but I do write about the nationalist movement in the book. And definitely, you see. I mean, I think the way I would explain it is that although the American Irish had their own organizations, and the Ladies Auxiliary of the AOH in America predates Ireland. But of course, in many ways, the American Irish are reacting to groups that are already founded in Ireland. So the Gaelic League of America is founded, you know, based on inspiration of the Gaelic League in Ireland, and it's the same way for nationalist groups. But you have a lot of contact going back and forth, and then of course you have people moving back and forth as well. And I think that shows up a lot in the nationalist movement. What I found interesting is it also shows up to some extent in the suffrage movement. So you get people coming over. Of course, American suffragists were really never as militant as suffragists, you know, in the UK. And so you get inspiration both from British and Irish suffragists who are coming over and sort of inspiring, you know, the American movement. And so I do try to talk a little bit about that, sort of the relationships between the two and some of the things that they did. But some of the specifically sort of suffrage movements, and then ultimately you do have in the U.S. Kind of a separate Catholic suffrage movement. But again, the U.S. is a little bit later in founding Catholic suffrage societies. So there are Catholic suffrage societies in England, Ireland, and I want to say France already before the American Catholics really get themselves organized. And I try to do research on those groups as well. It's very hard to find stuff, but of course many of the leaders end up being Irish American as well.
I was wondering about the Wilson reference that you mentioned. You said you got touched upon.
Oh, and the Barrie, I was in the Barrie Monument dedication when Wilson gave the speech, and he basically told Irish Americans that they should leave the hyphen and become fully American. That was a moment, I think, that not only offended a lot of people, but also, you know, that Jolly talks about that moment, 1914 being an inspiration for the second the monument movement. But also, I've seen some references to her speech at that, at the Barrie dedication. So she was not only there, but she spoke at it as well.
Thank you very much for that lecture. I'm curious to know if one was married at that time, were you able to continue your career as a nurse, as a teacher, and maybe even as a domestic? How did the AOH feel about that at the time?
I mean, with school teachers, you don't usually see married school teachers, and some school districts specifically had a policy of not hiring married school teachers or even dismissing them. I use this is something from my class, which is much later, but I use this example in my class when I'm talking about the 1930s, that even during the Great Depression, that these big urban school districts had a policy of automatically dismissing women teachers as soon as they married and not hiring married women. What I have come across in this research, although not specifically these women, is that there are women who tried to hide their marriages So, and this came, there was a Catholic suffragist, this story comes from, that she essentially, she didn't marry till she was older, maybe 40s, maybe even older, married this much younger man. But she also tried to keep it secret because she didn't want to lose her job. And I think there were more, if you start digging, I imagine you'd find quite a lot of those stories. I've never seen any specific discussion of that within the AOH. But of course there were, you know, particularly by the early 20th century, a really large number, or Irish women were moving into teaching in large numbers. So it wouldn't be surprising that there would be a large number of school teachers in the ladies' auxiliary.
Did you ever contact the LAOH for information?
Yes, well, when I was working on this, when I was a long time ago, when I started working on this, I started emailing local chapters, historians. I don't remember if I emailed the national historian at some point, but I did meet, well, I finished my grad work in 2005, so this was a long time ago. But I did meet some women who were active in the ladies' auxiliary at the time. I wasn't able to find local records that went back far enough to what I was looking for. And they haven't been archived, and at least the ones that I tried to contact, the ones that were, you know, around in the 19th century, didn't have records either. But there, I mean, there might still be some, you know, hidden stash out there. I haven't found it yet. If anyone knows.
There is.
Let me know.
I'm from the national board of the LAOH.
You are? Oh, okay.
I'm a past national president.
Well, then you know anybody.
And we do have our archives up in Boston College.
Awesome.
They've got a lot of stuff at Catholic University. And Ellen Jolly Ryan, our family gave all of her papers and stuff to Notre Dame.
Yes,
So
and I
we
have those.
a lot of their stuff, they're just not digitized.
Right, I have those letters.
So, the wine is waiting for us downstairs, and so I think we can actually continue the conversation downstairs. There'll also be a book signing, and so thank you so much, Tara McCarthy, for one.